The North African sun had barely risen, casting long, cruel shadows across the sand-strewn encampment. In a small tent lined with maps and military dispatches, Erwin Rommel, the desert fox, stood silently, his eyes tracing the jagged coastline far below. The wind carried with it the faint stench of oil and gunpowder from the front line, mingling with the distant cries of men burdened by duty and fear. Rommel, usually a man of resolute composure, allowed himself a rare moment of human vulnerability. A letter, worn at the edges, lay open on the table. A note from his wife, reflecting a world he could not touch, a life far removed from the relentless calculus of war. He knew the stakes. The Africa Corps was stretched thin, supplies dwindling, morale fragile. To the west, British forces under General Auchinleck fortified their positions near El Alamein, a narrow choke point that could decide the fate of the North African campaign. A single misstep here, a delayed order or misjudged maneuver, could unravel months of painstaking strategy and consign thousands of men to death in the desert heat. Rommel's mind raced through contingencies. Tanks, infantry, artillery, all were pieces in a brutal chess game where hesitation spelled disaster. Yet, despite his reputation for audacity, he wrestled with restraint. Intelligence reports had suggested an opportunity to cut off the British supply lines, an action that could turn the tide. But Rommel hesitated. He knew the cost of a failed assault. Every bold stroke carried the weight of human lives, thousands of them, entrusted to the decisions of a single man. Hours passed. The desert light shifted, turning the sand to a burning gold. Rommel moved from the map table to a nearby cot, running a hand over his face, the weight of command pressing down like the oppressive midday sun. Soldiers outside the tent whispered rumors, speculated about orders that might never come. The desert fox had earned a fearsome reputation for decisiveness, yet here, on the edge of one of the war's most pivotal battles, he paused. The tension in the tent was palpable. The maps lay sprawled across the table, dotted with the positions of British and Axis forces, lines of advance and retreat sketched in charcoal. Each mark represented a life, a possibility, a gamble. And yet, in this rare moment of indecision, Rommel was not calculating victory alone. He was calculating survival, the fragility of human life beneath the machinery of war. It was here, in this fraught stillness, that the decision that would never come, or that would arrive too late, was suspended in the desert air, shaping events in ways history would later only partially reveal. The night of March 23, 1942, fell swiftly over El Alamein, bringing with it a brittle silence, broken only by the distant rumble of British reconnaissance vehicles and the faint clatter of German sentries pacing the perimeter. Inside Rommel's tent, the maps lay untouched, the charcoal lines of strategy frozen under the weight of indecision. For the desert fox, every tick of the clock was a reminder that delay carried consequences as lethal as an enemy shell. Rommel's aide, Hauptmann Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, entered quietly, a folder of intelligence clutched in his hands. "Field Marshal," he said, his voice careful, "the reports are consistent. The British are vulnerable along the northern supply route. We could cut them off tomorrow." Rommel did not respond immediately. He traced the lines on the map with a rigid finger, imagining the German divisions maneuvering through the shifting desert dunes. He could visualize it, the tanks advancing, the infantry pressing forward, the encirclement completed before the enemy could react. Yet he hesitated. The terrain was treacherous. The supply lines of his own forces were overstretched. One miscalculation, and the Africa Corps could be trapped in the very desert they sought to dominate. "I know," he said finally, his voice low, almost a confession. "The gamble is great, but so is the risk of waiting." He paused, staring at the maps as if seeking counsel from the sand itself. "If I commit, we may strike a decisive blow. But if we fail, the consequences will be catastrophic." The night deepened. Outside, the desert sky was a canopy of stars, indifferent to the human struggles unfolding beneath it. Rommel moved to the tent flap, drawing back the canvas to peer into the darkness. In the distance, British searchlights swept the dunes, glinting against the occasional silhouette of armored vehicles. The world beyond the tent seemed immense, uncaring, yet the tent itself felt claustrophobic, weighted by the lives and destinies suspended upon his choice. Hours passed in tense deliberation. Rommel scribbled notes, crossed out maneuvers, recalculated fuel and ammunition. The silence was punctuated only by the soft rustle of paper and the occasional murmur of von Arnim offering observations. Each option carried a human cost measured in men, machinery, and the fragile morale of an army already pushed to its limits. By dawn, the moment had passed. Rommel's hand hovered over the map, indecision rooted like a stone in the desert sand. Orders that might have changed the course of the campaign were never issued that night. The Africa Corps would remain poised on the precipice, waiting as the British forces reinforced their positions, unknowingly gaining precious hours that would alter the unfolding battle. In that quiet, unremarkable dawn, the consequences of hesitation were already taking shape, silent, invisible, yet inevitable. Rommel, the master tactician, had left a command unspoken, a choice deferred, and the desert would remember. Dawn broke over the northern edge of the Al Alamein line, painting the sand in muted golds and grays, the heat already simmering beneath the thin winter sky. The desert, so often portrayed as an endless, impersonal expanse, was in truth a crucible, one that tested not only the endurance of men but the clarity of their decisions. Rommel, standing once more at his tent's entrance, watched the horizon where the British forces had quietly consolidated their positions overnight. Every ridge, every dune now bore witness to what might have been, the ghosts of delayed orders lurking in the shifting sand. Inside the tent, the maps remained spread across the table. Each pencil stroke represented more than strategy. It was a ledger of lives: infantry, tank crews, engineers, and supply men whose fate now hung in the balance of a command not yet given. Rommel's aides were restless, their faces etched with tension. Hauptmann von Arnim, perceptive and disciplined, broke the silence with a cautious inquiry. "Field Marshal, our reconnaissance confirms the British have reinforced the northern passes. Should we reconsider the assault?" Rommel's eyes did not leave the map. He was calculating not in abstract numbers, but in human terms. He considered the men who would charge over open ground under artillery fire, the tanks that could become immobile targets, and the supply lines that could be severed before they had truly begun. He knew the British were fewer in number here than at the main defenses, yet he also understood that courage alone would not carry men through well-prepared obstacles. His mind traced the lines of possible maneuvers, imagining his units swept into action, imagining both the success and the carnage that might follow. The clock ticked relentlessly. Outside, the desert air shimmered with the heat rising from the sand, and distant vehicles kicked up trails of dust as reconnaissance patrols probed the terrain. Rommel stepped away from the map table for a moment, running a hand across his face, the familiar gesture of a man burdened by responsibility. He recalled letters from his family, small fragments of home in a war-torn world. Their words were fragile and tender, a stark contrast to the machinery of death awaiting beyond the canvas walls of his headquarters. By mid-morning, Rommel convened a meeting with his senior officers. The table became a stage for debate, strategy, and subtle negotiation of risk. Generals and captains leaned in, presenting calculations, assessing terrain, evaluating morale. Rommel listened more than he spoke, nodding occasionally, his piercing eyes revealing nothing. Yet beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. Each option carried consequences that could not be undone. Every decision, even one delayed, would ripple across the desert, shaping the lives of thousands of men and the fate of the campaign itself. Orders could be drafted in minutes, but the act of giving them, of committing the Africa Corps to action, was a different matter entirely. Rommel's inner conflict was not born of cowardice but of responsibility. He was acutely aware that boldness could achieve victory, yet recklessness could obliterate all hope. The British, patient and disciplined, had gained a subtle advantage simply by the passage of time. Their reinforcements, though modest, were enough to strengthen the line, to make any frontal assault a gamble with higher stakes. Afternoon came and went, the sun casting harsh shadows across the desert. Rommel returned to the map, pencil poised but unmoving. The aides whispered possibilities, an attack at dawn, a feint, an encirclement. Rommel weighed each, envisioning the human cost and the mechanical logistics. He imagined the groaning of tanks, the cries of wounded men, the dust rising like a curtain between life and death. And yet he could not yet commit. The order that might have defined the battle, that might have changed the trajectory of the North African campaign, remained unspoken, a silent choice suspended over the desert. As the day waned, Rommel's indecision crystallized into an unspoken reality. Time had shifted, the initiative now tilted subtly toward the British. The Africa Corps, still poised for movement, had missed a critical window. Outside the tent, soldiers carried on, unaware that history's turning point had already passed them by. They trusted their leaders, moved with precision and discipline, yet their fate was tethered to an order that lingered in the mind of the desert fox. In that late afternoon stillness, Rommel walked alone across the tented compound. The desert wind whipped at his coat, carrying with it the scent of distant artillery, sand, and exhaustion. For a man celebrated for his daring, it was a rare and bitter taste of frustration, to see opportunity shadowed by caution, to realize that even the most brilliant strategist was at the mercy of timing and circumstance. The sun dipped lower, spilling orange and crimson over the sand. Rommel returned to the maps, finally placing a tentative mark for an advance, but it was too little, too late. The order he might have given the day before had been delayed, and the consequences were already set in motion. Somewhere in the dunes, thousands of men waited, unaware that their survival or death was suspended in the mind of one man. History would later ask why the desert fox hesitated, and in the silence of El Alamein, the answer lay not in weakness but in the human weight of command. Decisions in war were never merely tactical, they were moral, emotional, and inevitably flawed. And in that moment, Rommel faced the profound, unyielding truth that even genius could not bend the desert to its will. The morning began with a dull, distant thunder. It was not yet combat, but the sound of engines, columns of British transports, armored carriers, and supply convoys moving methodically into the line. Dust clouds lifted across the horizon, faint at first, then unmistakable. What had been a vulnerable corridor only days earlier was now hardening into something far more formidable. Rommel stood beside his staff car, binoculars raised, silent. He understood immediately. The window had closed. Behind him, officers murmured as new intelligence came in. Intercepted signals confirmed what the distant columns already revealed. British reinforcements had arrived from Alexandria and Cairo. Fuel, ammunition, artillery batteries, fresh infantry. Enough to turn a calculated strike into a massacre. The order he had not given now echoed louder than any command he might issue. Inside the forward operations tent, the air was thick with tension. Radios crackled as reports filtered in, minefields reinforced, anti-tank positions dug deeper, artillery calibrated and zeroed. The northern supply corridor, the same artery Rommel had contemplated severing, was now guarded, patrolled, protected. Von Arnim spread the latest reconnaissance photographs across the table. "Field Marshal," he said carefully, "what was open is now sealed." Rommel studied the images without reply. A lesser commander might have denied reality, forcing men forward to satisfy pride or to erase hesitation. But Rommel saw what others sometimes refused to see. The battlefield had changed. Time had become an enemy. He thought not of glory, but of the men who would drive into gunfire they could not escape. Outside, engineers rattled past with crates of explosives. A medic paused near the tent entrance, wiping sweat from his brow, unaware that the battle he feared had already shifted shape. In war, silence often meant danger. Today, it meant something far more complicated, consequences unfolding without a single shot fired. By midday, Rommel convened another briefing. Maps were revised. The salt arrows were erased. New lines emerged, defensive postures, probing maneuvers, a measured pullback of forward elements. His officers exchanged glances. They understood. An offensive dream had become a survival plan. "This position," Rommel said, tapping the map, "is no longer an opportunity. It is now a trap. We conserve strength. We watch. We wait. The British have the initiative, for now." He spoke with calm authority, yet there was an undercurrent of severity in his tone, as though addressing history itself. Beyond the tent, the desert was alive with preparation, not for triumph, but for endurance. Mechanics worked on sand-choked engines. Gunners calibrated optics. Infantrymen cleaned rifles with methodical resignation. They sensed a shift they could not name. The Africa Corps was no longer hunting. It was bracing. That afternoon, British artillery tested its range. A handful of shells landed in the dunes, not yet lethal, more like warnings, messages whispered across the desert. Rommel watched the plumes rise and dissipate into the vast sky. Each explosion was a reminder of a battle that would now be fought on the enemy's terms. For a commander known for daring thrusts and sudden blows, it was a bitter acknowledgment. He had not lost a battle in the traditional sense. No charge had failed. No flank had collapsed. He had lost something more intangible, initiative. As twilight settled, Rommel walked alone along the perimeter, boots sinking into the soft sand. He listened to the talk of soldiers, the quiet jokes, the bravado masking uncertainty. He recognized the fragility beneath it. War demanded myth, but men lived with reality. At the edge of camp, he paused and looked back. Had he acted 2 nights earlier, history might have taken another path. Or perhaps it would have ended in disaster. There was no certainty in war, only decisions and the shadows they cast across the lives of others. Behind him, the desert wind whispered through the canvas. Ahead of him, the next phase of the campaign loomed, harder, bloodier, more unforgiving. And somewhere in the silence, the order he never gave continued to haunt the sand. The desert had shifted from silent tension to a slow tightening of the noose. Supply convoys crawled along the battered tracks, thin, exposed, endlessly vulnerable to British aircraft. Dust plumes marked their progress like beacons, and every driver knew what that meant. Visibility was death. Engines rattled. Radiators overheated. Fuel was rationed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The consequences of hesitation were no longer theoretical. They were logistical, immediate, and merciless. Rommel moved along the convoy staging area, his boots sinking into powder-soft sand. Mechanics looked up briefly, nodding, before returning to their work. His presence still commanded respect, even admiration. But admiration did not refill fuel drums, nor did it conjure spare parts out of thin air. He felt the strain pressing inward like the heat. Reports filtered in from the front. British patrols grew bolder, pushing into no man's land, testing the Axis lines with skirmishes and probing fire. Their artillery, now firmly positioned, spoke more often, registering targets piece by piece, mapping the desert with methodical precision. Rommel studied the latest dispatches inside his command tent. Ammunition shortfalls. Fuel losses. Vehicles abandoned because they could not be repaired. War, stripped of rhetoric, was suddenly an exercise in arithmetic. Von Arnim placed a chart on the table. If we attack now, we cannot sustain momentum. Within 48 hours our tanks would stall. We would be exposed. Rommel nodded once, curtly. He knew. He had known it the moment the British convoys appeared days earlier. Yet acknowledging it out loud was something else entirely. It meant sealing off one of the few remaining paths to offensive initiative. He traced a finger along the projected British advance line. "They are preparing," he murmured. "Not for defense alone. They are shaping the field." In the dunes beyond the front, small firefights flared and faded. German and Italian patrols clashed with Commonwealth units, Australians, South Africans, British infantry, each side taking measure of the other. Casualties trickled back to the field hospitals. Men burned by shrapnel, lungs filled with dust and smoke, eyes clouded with exhaustion. Inside the medical tent, the air smelled of iodine and sand. A nurse guided Rommel past the cots. He paused, eyes resting briefly on a young soldier, barely more than a boy, whose leg had been amputated below the knee. The soldier saluted weakly. Rommel returned it, solemn. Here, the debate over initiative felt abstract, almost obscene. Outside again, the wind rose, sending waves of sand across the camp. The Africa Corps was beginning to feel cornered, not geographically, but strategically. trapped by scarcity, by enemy preparation, and by a decision suspended in time. That night, Rommel gathered his senior officers. Maps unfolded once more, but the arrows this time were different, shorter, more conservative. Defensive depth, countermobility, reserves held back to absorb the impact of an inevitable strike. "We will not squander what we cannot replace," Rommel said. "We fight when it matters, not when pride demands it." His voice was controlled, yet the undercurrent was unmistakable, frustration tempered by realism. Outside, a British flare arced into the sky, casting the desert in white light for a brief, blinding instant before fading into darkness. The battlefield was becoming a stage set for someone else's plan. And Rommel, once master of tempo, now found himself reacting, recalibrating, thinking in terms of survival rather than audacity. In the quiet that followed, the unspoken truth lingered. One order, never given, had begun to define the campaign more powerfully than any order he had signed. Night settled over the desert like a heavy cloak. The wind had quieted, the sand lay still, and the horizon glowed faintly with the intermittent flashes of distant artillery, testing ranges, recalibrating trajectories, feeling out the map of death that was soon to be drawn in full. Rommel stood over a lantern-lit table, studying the latest reconnaissance sketches. British formations were reorganizing, artillery massing with deliberate precision, armor redeployed in layered echelons, infantry trenches deepening like scars across the earth. What had once been a porous front had become a fortified threshold. He knew what it meant. The British were not merely holding El Alamein. They were preparing to break the campaign open. Von Arnim approached quietly, a dispatch in hand. "Field Marshal, forward observers report increased movement after dusk. Canvas. Likely additional artillery." Rommel did not look up immediately. When he did, there was no surprise in his expression. "Then they have chosen the tempo," he replied. Outside, the camp hummed with subdued activity. Crews checked ammunition stocks, reinforced dugouts, camouflaged positions. The Afrika Korps, long accustomed to striking first, now braced itself for impact. The men spoke less than usual. There was a sober understanding that what was coming would not be brief, nor easily reversed. In the early hours, Rommel walked the forward line. He moved past tank crews crouched beside their vehicles, past machine gun nests carefully sighted on likely avenues of approach, past soldiers writing letters against their knees in the dim glow of pocket lamps, letters sealed with uncertainty, addressed to homes that felt impossibly distant. He stopped beside an anti-tank unit positioned on a low ridge. "Hold your fire until you see silhouettes," Rommel instructed quietly. "Waste nothing. Precision over impulse." The officer nodded, absorbing every word. The desert was no longer the wide-open canvas Rommel had mastered. It had narrowed into a corridor of attrition, mines, wire, overlapping fields of fire. Strategy had become containment. Initiative had slipped into the realm of enemy design. And yet, responsibility had not diminished. Back at headquarters, he dictated orders with measured clarity. Rotations to conserve strength. Night patrols to disrupt British reconnaissance. Strict fuel controls. Every decision was a negotiation with scarcity. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the map where the northern supply route was marked in faded ink. There, days earlier, had been the opening. a moment in time when audacity might have redefined the field. Now it existed only as a memory embedded in the sand, eclipsed by the reality of reinforced lines and an opponent ready to force the issue on their own terms. As dawn crept over the horizon, the first British barrage began. Not overwhelming at once, rather deliberate, systematic, like a drumbeat establishing rhythm. Shells fell in probing sequences, walking the line, searching for weaknesses. The ground trembled. Dust billowed upward. Radios crackled with terse reports. Rommel stepped outside, the blast waves rolling across the desert, the air tasting of cordite. He did not flinch. Instead, he watched carefully, marking positions mentally, identifying patterns. If he could no longer dictate the start of the battle, he would dictate how his men endured it, and how they struck back when opportunity emerged again. War was not a single decision. It was an accumulation of them, some loud, some silent, and some, like the one left unspoken days earlier, casting a long, invisible shadow across everything that followed. As the artillery intensified, the desert shook to life. Engines roared to readiness. Orders moved down the line. Men settled into their positions with grim resolve. Rommel turned away from the horizon and returned to the map table. There would be no rewriting the past. Only the difficult art of surviving what it had created.